Welcome everyone to today's webinar, which focuses on low-calorie sweeteners as one tool for the reduction of added sugars intake. My name is Marie Latulippe and I'm staff with ILSI North America. We're very excited to have you today. We'll start by way of a little background on the topic. We all probably know a long-standing nutrition concern across the globe, with very few exceptions, is excessive intake of added sugars. Over 90% of North Americans exceed the recommended limit for added sugars in the diet. And as a result, consumers and practitioners really need practical and well-accepted tools to reduce the intake of added sugars. And one of these tools is low-calorie sweeteners. And although a variety of low-calorie sweeteners have been approved as safe by global regulatory authorities, there is continuing confusion around whether or not low-calorie sweeteners are a reasonable option for replacement of sugars in the diet. And our objective today is to promote the understanding of how the safety of low-calorie sweeteners is evaluated by authoritative groups like the US FDA, how we can apply this knowledge, and then finally we'd like to provide practitioners with messages that can be used in your practice. This webinar is organized by two groups, and you see the logos on that first slide there, Diabetes Canada and ILSI North America. And we just wanted to spend a couple minutes on each organization in case you are not that familiar. And ILSI North America, to start with, is a nonprofit organization that focuses on the understanding and the application of science as related to the nutritional quality and safety of the food supply. And this organization operates under a tripartite model, and you see that icon to the left there. The idea is that we bring together scientists from these three sectors to operate cooperatively and with shared responsibility to provide science that improves the health of the public. And on the next slide here, you see our core values. And the idea is that these core values are reflected in all of our meetings, as well as in the research that the organization supports. And if you would like to learn more about this organization, you can feel free to visit the website, and that's shown at the bottom of the slide there. It's www.ilsina.org. Now, Diabetes Canada is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to leading the fight against diabetes. And they do this through three primary tactics. And those are helping those that are already affected by diabetes to live healthy lives. They also work to prevent the onset and the consequences of the disease. And then finally, they invest in research towards discovering a cure for diabetes. Diabetes Canada has actually been helping people affected by diabetes for over 60 years. And in fact, young Canadians now face a 50-50 chance of having diabetes in their lifetime. That's why you can see diabetes has a real sense of urgency about moving forward as an organization to deliver greater impact at the population level. And just to mention, as we get started in the webinar, you should see a chat box in your screen there, and you should feel free to type any questions as the webinar proceeds. So no need to wait until the end to let us know what you would like to ask. This webinar has also been approved for one continuing education unit by the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and you can also receive a certificate of completion from Diabetes Canada, and we'll let you know at the end of the webinar exactly how you can do that. So here's an outline of what we'd like to talk about today. First, we'll have Dr. Anyang Wei tell us a little bit about how food ingredients are evaluated for safety at the US FDA. We'll also hear from Diabetes Canada on their position related to the importance of reducing the use of added sugars and how low-calorie sweeteners could be a tool. And we'll hear about the application of the ADI, that's the acceptable daily intake value, that will be covered by the first speaker. and how that's applied in nutrition research. And then finally, we'll give you some ideas about how to use this information in your nutrition practice. So with that, we will welcome our first speaker, Dr. Juen Anyangwe. Dr. Anyangwe is a regulatory toxicologist at the US FDA, where she evaluates the safety of direct food ingredients. Dr. Anyangwe is a multidisciplinary scientist who has education and experience in many areas of science, and those include biochemistry, nutrition, molecular biology, toxicology, and probably other areas as well. Dr. Anyangwe has over 18 years of higher education experience teaching a variety of courses, and those courses include nutrition and health. And with that, I'll hand the platform over to Dr. Anyangwe to tell us a bit about the US FDA.
Thank you so much, Marie, for that kind introduction. I want to make sure, can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay. So I'm going to speak to you this afternoon about the safety evaluation of food additives before they go into the market by the US FDA. And these are my views and not necessarily the views of the Food and Drug Administration. So the FDA has its mission to promote and protect public health by ensuring the safety of the nation's drugs, food supply, including dietary supplements, medical devices, cosmetics, biologics, and tobacco products. So that's really the mission of the Food and Drug Administration. Within the FDA, there are several centers. One of the centers is the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And within that center, you have the Office of Food Additive Safety. This is the office that's responsible for ensuring that all ingredients added to food are safe. So the mission of the Office of Food Additive Safety is to protect and enhance consumer health by ensuring the safety of all substances added to food and any substance that comes into contact with food. So why does FDA have the ability to regulate food ingredients? For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on food additives, but I want you to also understand that this office does regulate a wide variety of food ingredients, and one of them is the generally recognized as safe substances. However, for this presentation, I'm going to focus on food additives. So there was an amendment in 1958 to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act called the Food Additives Amendment of 1958. That amendment defined what you call food additives. And the food additive is defined as any substance, the intended use of which results or may reasonably be expected to result directly or indirectly in it becoming a component or otherwise affecting the characteristics of food. So any substance that's used in the packaging, preparation, storage, transportation of food is considered a food additive. The indirect food additives are the food contact substances. Again, for this presentation, my focus is going to be on direct food additives. Here you have a list of categories of direct food additives. You have the sweeteners, you have the preservatives, nutrients, fat substitutes, texturizers, flavoring agents. You might have had a cup of coffee today and maybe you might have added some Splenda in it. So that's something we do regulate to ensure that before it gets to your table, it's safe for your consumption. So Section 409 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act says that for a food additive to go into the market, there must be data submitted to the FDA to ensure that that food additive is safe. And what is really safe? Safe in terms of food additive means that there is reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful under the intended conditions of use. And the safety standard for food additive is reasonable certainty of no harm. The burden of proof is on the petitioner. The petitioner has to assemble all data, whether favorable or not, about the safety of their ingredient under the intended conditions of use and submit that to the agency for review. And I want to talk about this provision of the amendment called the Delaney Clause. The Delaney Clause says that the FDA cannot approve any food additive if it's found to cause cancer in man or animals. I would have to say that this applies to the food additive, but not to any impurities or components. So how do we do safety evaluation of food additives. Basically, it's a risk assessment process. You have the toxicology assessment, you have the exposure assessment, and you have a risk characterization. So the exposure assessment is typically done by a chemist, and they provide us with an estimated daily intake or a cumulative estimated daily intake. And this is usually based on the 90th percentile consumer, because that gives us the high chronic dietary exposure for that particular food additive. I am a toxicologist, so I do review the toxicology part of it. So the data comes in and we review the toxicology of it, determine what the hazard is, characterize the hazard, that's a dose response, and from that data, calculate what you call an acceptable daily intake, and compare that acceptable daily intake to the estimated daily intake, and by that we're characterizing the risk. As toxicologists, we know that the dose makes the poison. So even if there's something you have, and even if there's a hazard associated with it, if there's no exposure, then there really isn't any risk. Or if the exposure is very low compared to the dose at which you find the hazard, then the risk is very minimal, or there isn't any risk. So typically in a petition, the studies that we get would be a subchronic study that's done for about 90 days, 13 weeks, chronic study done for 6 months or more, and then we have absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So how does that ingredient get absorbed? How is it distributed within the body? How is it metabolized? How is it excreted? And then we also saw genotoxicity data, which indicates damage to DNA, developmental and reprotoxicity data, carcinogenicity data. And sometimes, depending on some of the signals that we get in these studies or the nature of the ingredient, we could also recommend that the petitioner submit neurotox data, immunotox data. And also, if it's a protein, we would expect to see some allergenicity data. And the focus for the toxicologists when we do assess this data is to look at where we have toxicological findings that are adverse. You could have a toxicological finding. For example, you could have an increase in liver weight. Is that really adverse? So you have to look at the liver enzymes and look at the histopath data and do all of that to make a determination whether or not that finding you see is adverse. Sometimes we also do have human studies. Typically, we don't have as many clinical trials as drugs do, but we do see short-term clinical studies. We call them tolerance studies, where they're typically looking at the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. You can all find this protocol or the guidance in our FDA Red Book on how to conduct some of these studies. So from the toxicological study, we determine what we call a point of departure. That point of departure is a point on a toxicological dose-response curve established from experimental data or observational data generally corresponding to an estimated low effect or no effect. This really marks the beginning of extrapolation to a toxicological safe level. So there are 2 points of departure. Typically, we use the no observed adverse effect level. So this is the dose at which the highest dose at which there is no observable adverse effect. So let's say you have 4 doses in a study, and let's say at the highest dose you start seeing changes in liver weight, enzymes, and all of that. The dose next to that will be considered the dose where you do not see any adverse effect, and that's the no observed adverse effect level. There's also a point of departure called the benchmark dose lower bound, BMDR, and this takes into consideration the whole dose response curve. So we use that point of departure, which could be a NOEL or a BMDR, and divide it by an uncertainty factor. So what that factor does is to extrapolate the animal data you get from animal studies to humans, the interspecies differences between animals and humans, the intraspecies differences between one human and the other, and sometimes if that NOEL comes from a shorter term study, say a 90-day study instead of a 1-year study, we could include an additional uncertainty factor. For food additives, we typically use 100 because this data most of the time would come from chronic studies. So we divide that point of departure, which could be a NOEL, over the uncertainty factor, which is 100, and we get what we call an acceptable daily intake. So there are 2 definitions of the acceptable daily intake that I found online from the European Food Safety Authority. The first definition of an acceptable daily intake is an estimate of the amount of a substance in food or drinking water that can be consumed over a lifetime without presenting an appreciable risk to health. And this is expressed in mg per kilogram body weight per day. The definition from Science Direct says is the maximum amount of a chemical that can be ingested daily over a lifetime with no appreciable risk. And this is based on the highest intake that doesn't give rise to any observable adverse effect. So now we are talking about that no observed adverse effect level. So for nutritionists in the audience, an acceptable daily intake is a safe level, and it's kind of comparable to what you have for nutrients, the tolerable upper intake level. So at the end now you have the CEDI or the EDI, and you also have coming from the chemist, the exposure assessment, and you also have an ADI coming from the toxicological assessment. So you have to characterize the risk. One way to characterize this risk is to compare the EDI or the CEDI to the ADI. If the exposure, the estimated daily intake is less than the acceptable daily intake, then it's considered safe. When you see the reverse, if the EDI is greater than the ADI, then there is a problem. Another way to characterize risk is using what we call the margin of exposure. The margin of exposure is the NOEL over the EDI or the BMDL over the EDI. The higher the margin of exposure, the lower the risk. The default is 100. And sometimes we consider the totality of the evidence. What does the distribution, what does the metabolism say? Do you have the same metabolites that are active that you find in animals, in humans? Is the mode of action the same? One example I'll give here is like the renal tumor you find in male rats involving a protein called the alpha-2 myoglobulin. You do not have that protein in humans. So when you see a renal tumor in male rats, it's definitely not relevant to humans. So I just want to give you a table here since the focus for this webinar is on sweeteners. This is just a table that shows you the EDIs compared to the ADIs of several approved sweeteners. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to point you to aspartame. Aspartame, also known as NutraSweet or Equal, the FDA established an ADI of 50 for aspartame, and the EDI is 8.7. So based on what I just said, if the EDI is less than the ADI, 8.7 is less than 50. Therefore, it's considered safe. And you see the same thing for alpha-systeine K, also known as SUNET, you see for advantane, and you see for sucralose. One thing I want to point out here too is the number of tabletop sweetener packets equivalent to the ADI. So let's take sucralose. So the ADI for sucralose established by the FDA is 5 mg per kilogram body weight, and that's equivalent to 23 packets of the tabletop sweetener. So you have to consume 23 for you to get to the ADI. So I want to use advantane as a case study very quickly. So advantane is a non-nutritive sweetener that was approved by the FDA in 2014. It's also been approved in Canada, Europe, and Australia and New Zealand. So this is just to tell you how much data comes in the petition. For advantane, there were 37 clinical studies done in different animal models, rat, mouse, rabbit, dog, and the studies range from cancer studies to neurotox to immunotox to ADME data. And the pivotal studies were all done under good laboratory practices. And there were 4 clinical studies done in healthy and type 2 diabetics. So for advantane, even though there were 37 clinical studies and 4 human studies, of these, 4 of these studies were found to be critical studies in that petition. A rat 2-gen reproductive study, a dog 52-week study, mouse 2-year bioassay, and a rat 2-year bioassay. The rat 2-year bioassay was the study that was used to determine the ADI. The Cancer Assessment Committee of the FDA concluded that advantane treatment did not result in any increased incidence of tumors in rats in this 2-year bioassay. And the 1-year portion of that assay was used to calculate the ADI, to determine what the NOEL was. That was used to calculate the ADI for several reasons. It was 52 weeks long, there was a survival group, and there was no cancer in the 2-year bioassay. So the highest dose in that study, there were 4 doses, 0, 2,000 ppm, 10,000 ppm, and 50,000 ppm. And the highest dose of 50,000 ppm was found to be the NOEL. And that was converted to mg per kilogram body weight to be 3,279. And when you divide that on 100, the ADI for advantane was found to be 32.8 mg per kilogram body weight per day. The EDI was estimated to be 0.167. So again, you see here that the EDI is less than the ADI and therefore considered safe. And if you convert that to per person per day by multiplying by 60, it's still considered safe. So FDA, based on the data that was submitted in that petition, concluded that there is reasonable certainty that the substance is not harmful under the conditions of use and therefore approved Avantane. So in conclusion, I want the consumers to know that the FDA food additive petition review process is a rigorous, science-based process. It is a sound process marked by scientific rigor and high integrity. And before a food additive gets to that consumer table, it has gone through thorough scientific investigation. And ADIs are safe levels to give consumers the confidence. And as new data becomes available, might have to go back and reevaluate the safety of the food additives. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Anyangwe. In our next talk, we'll hear from Diabetes Canada about their position on added sugars intake, as well as how they incorporate some of this low-calorie sweetener safety evaluation information into their materials and messaging. So our next presenter is Joanne Lewis. Joanne is a registered dietitian as well as the Director of Knowledge Management at Diabetes Canada, and she has worked there for over 6 years. She's involved in developing position statements and advising on policies related to diabetes care and management, as well as the dissemination of the clinical practice guidelines. Joanne has several years of experience practicing in clinical settings, as well as in the development of diabetes education material and programming. So we will now hand the platform over to you, Joanne.
Thank you, Marie, for the introduction and for the opportunity to be a part of this panel presentation today. It's a real pleasure for Diabetes Canada to be able to partner with ILSI to bring this webinar to you, and I want to acknowledge also my colleague Erin Krusky, who's responsible for working closely with ILSI and for ensuring that we have a great turnout for today's presentation. And the response was actually really positive, so that means that this is a topic that many people are really interested in learning more about, so thank you everyone for being here. And also a huge thank you to Lindsay Clark from Timed Right for making sure that everyone got logged in and the technology works. So it's no surprise that to anyone that diabetes has a serious impact on the health and quality of life in Canada. A diagnosis of diabetes or prediabetes is made every 3 minutes. Understanding what causes type 2 diabetes is more important now than ever. And sorry, I'm just trying to advance my screen, which I'm not having any luck doing. So let me do that. There we go. Apologies for that. So understanding what causes type 2 diabetes is more important now than ever. And if we can prevent the onset of diabetes and prediabetes, we stand a better chance of improving the health and lives of Canadians. So I won't take up too much time as there are other speakers who have a lot of very interesting information to share with you today. But essentially, these are the key takeaway messages from Diabetes Canada. Recently, sugar and especially sugar-sweetened beverages have grabbed the media's attention and the attention of health organizations such as Diabetes Canada, Heart and Stroke, and the World Health Organization. There's more evidence today that there are health implications of sugar consumption beyond dental caries. Recent research has evolved to demonstrate that there is a link between the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages and an increased risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and gestational diabetes. There is no one solution to reduce the amount of sugar Canadians consume. Rather, there are a number of different strategies that can play a role in today's discussion. In today's discussion, we are mostly focusing on one possible solution, and that is the substitution of sugar with low-calorie sweeteners. What we've learned is that individuals who consume more than or equal to 10% but less than 25% of total energy from added sugar have a 30% higher risk of death from heart disease or stroke when compared to those who consume less than 10%. And for those who consume 25% or more of calories from added sugar, the risk is nearly tripled. You may or may not be surprised to know that the single largest contributor of sugar in our diet is sugar-sweetened beverages. And individuals consuming more than one sugar-sweetened beverage per day have a higher risk of developing diabetes. And as added sugar consumption increases, the risk of death from heart disease and stroke also increases. And so in response to these findings, Diabetes Canada felt it was important to publish a position statement. The Diabetes Canada position statement on sugar was published in 2015, around the same time that the World Health Organization published its recommendations on the intake of free sugars. If you'd like to get a copy of the full position statement, please contact us at Diabetes Canada or check our website at diabetes.ca. The World Health Organization published 3 main recommendations in 2015. 2 of them are considered strong recommendations, and these are: 1, a recommendation for reduced intake of free sugars throughout the life course, and number 2, in both adults and children, intake of free sugars not exceed 10% of total energy, which is in line with the recommendations in Diabetes Canada's clinical practice guidelines. The World Health Organization also made a conditional recommendation to further reduce the intake of free sugars to 5% of total energy, but the evidence for this recommendation was low quality and it was related to dental caries only. 10% of total daily energy intake is about 50 grams of sugar, or 12 to 13 teaspoons of sugar a day. So how do average Canadians measure up to these recommendations? It's estimated that 15% of Canadians' daily caloric intake comes from sugars, which is about 75 grams of sugar a day, which is equal to about 2 cans of regular soda per day. And as Marie had mentioned earlier, that approximately over 90% of people worldwide exceed the intake or the acceptable intake or recommended intake of added sugar per day. Diabetes Canada, along with other health organizations, is advocating for alternative and healthier hydration strategies and the reduced intake of sugar-sweetened beverages. Some of the recommendations made in the position statement include a call to the government to implement a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages and use the revenues generated to promote the health of Canadians. To have clear nutrition labels on packaged food and include the amount of free sugars on these labels, to restrict and prevent marketing of foods to children and beverages to children, to support improved access and affordability to nutrition foods in all regions, to label free sugars on menus in restaurants to help consumers make more informed choices on what they eat, and for recreational events, schools, workplaces, facilities, government spaces, not to offer sugar-sweetened beverages for purchase and instead provide free water for consumption. A couple of years ago, the University of Waterloo looked at the sales data for soft drinks, fruit drinks, and 100% juice over the course of 11 years. Sales in all 3 of these categories decreased during this time period. However, sales of other popular sugar-sweetened beverages increased. These include energy drinks, sweetened coffee, sugar-sweetened flavored water, sugar-sweetened drinkable yogurt, sweetened tea, flavored milk, and sports drink. And so it's important in our messaging to the public to emphasize that sugar-sweetened beverages do not just include soft drinks. On this slide are a few examples of the type of communication that can be effective in educating the public about the amount of sugar in some common beverages. There are many examples of these online. This is an example of one that was created by Diabetes Canada. At Diabetes Canada, we no longer serve sugar-sweetened beverages at any events or meetings. We also have committed to serving healthier food options at events. And of course, we're asking and encouraging other organizations, particularly health organizations, to do the same. So a very common question that we hear from the public is diet soda better than regular soda? And as we were just seeing on the other slide, we're really not limiting this discussion to regular soda, as there are so many other sweetened beverages, sugar-sweetened beverages to choose from. However, this is a very common question. So we may not have all the answers about diet soda, but what we do know is that there are no nutritional benefits to drinking diet soda. So when we say better than regular soda, what we really mean is that diet sodas do not have the same harmful effects as sodas that contain sugar. But what we just heard in the previous talk was that acceptable daily intakes are considered safe, and that is definitely the message of Diabetes Canada. That when it comes to low-calorie sweeteners themselves, our position is that sweeteners used in our foods and drinks are regulated and safe to consume, that the ADI should be referred to when talking with the public, that it's a good idea to use information about the different types of sweeteners and how they're differently digested and the makeup of the various sweeteners, so that when you're counseling people about the amount that they're consuming in one day, that there are ways to not actually accumulate too much of any one sweetener over the course of the day by switching it up or using soft drinks that are sweetened with one type of sweetener, but then using a different sweetener in their coffee, let's say. We definitely need more high quality studies that look at long-term effects, and we should feel confident that artificial sweeteners do not cause harm and are safe to consume. On the right of your screen is an image of one of the education resources that Diabetes Canada has created to help educate the public about the use of low-calorie sweeteners. This is available for free as a free download on our website. So I'm going to end here so we can continue with the rest of the program, and I'd be happy to answer any questions later.
Great, thank you, Joanne. Our next talk will take a look at how a metric for safety, here the ADI, which was described by both of our previous speakers, how the ADI is applied in scientific research. And as Joanne noted, this research often forms the basis of professional practice guidelines, so it's important to understand its use. I would like to introduce Dr. Danielle Wyckoff, who is a health sciences practice leader for Talk Strategies, which is based in Asheville, North Carolina. She specializes in using evidence-based methods to evaluate health hazards and risks that are associated with exposures to a wide variety of consumer products, and that includes food ingredients and industrial chemicals. And Dr. Wyckoff's area of focus is on the use of systematic methods in support of risk assessment applications, including the development of health-based toxicity values. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Wyckoff.
Thank you, Marie. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this presentation today. It's a very interesting set of talks, and I think that as we have heard that the process for developing ADIs is very robust. Yet the communication of how to use ADIs continues to be somewhat complex. So that is what our focus of this research is, to help build tools to bridge that gap. Before saying more, it's important to disclose that this work that we'll be presenting on was commissioned by ILSI North America, and that a number of other disclosures from co-authors are provided in our protocol, though most are related to our various expertise with low-calorie sweeteners, and no conflicts were noted. So as I was mentioning, the overall objective of this project is really to create a resource for practitioners and public health professionals to help bridge and provide clarity on ADIs and the use the safe use of low-calorie sweeteners as it relates to safety goals. To do this, we felt like a baseline needed to be established looking at how ADIs and daily intake levels are being addressed in the context of ADIs in the peer-reviewed literature. So our overall approach was to look at what is available in the literature, to chart the types of publications and the ways the ADIs are being used, and then to think about that in context of the overall research question in terms of, is the ADI being used appropriately? What types of communication or what types of tools are needed to better help public health professionals and practitioners to better use and better understand ADIs and how to compare to EDIs, etc. This work is carried out by a multidisciplinary team. On the left is a table of authors, all from Talk Strategies, with a variety of backgrounds, including Ms. Seneca Fitch, who is also on the line today, who has been responsible for a large portion of this work. She is an information specialist and evidence analyst at Talk Strategies. And important to this work as well is we have a number of advisory panel members, one of whom you heard at the beginning, and also the fourth speaker in this presentation, who provide a high level of expertise as it relates to the toxicology of low-calorie sweeteners as well as nutritional aspects. All of this work is being held to very high transparency standards based on the Transparency and Openness Promotion, or TOP guidelines, and this entire project, including our protocol, are posted on the Open Science Framework, and this is freely available to visit the website here provided on this slide and find out information about this project. The systematic map that we are conducting is based on the Joanna Briggs Institute's framework for scoping reviews. Those terms are commonly used as synonyms: scoping or scoping reviews and systematic maps. The steps are shown on this slide. They're very linear in that you start with defining the objective and the question a priori. You make sure that that fits with overall research overall research objectives. You describe a plan for conducting and essentially addressing the question, and again, you do that a priori via protocol. You then, moving into the middle of the figure, once you have established a priori your methods, you go and conduct those methods, which generally involve extracting the evidence from what you've selected, then charting it based on characteristics that you've extracted, and then summarizing the evidence in relation to the research question, followed by reporting. And really where we're at in this project now is we have searched, extracted evidence, and we've been charting and synthesizing it relative to the findings. Again, I want to mention that the protocol is also available on the Open Science Framework. All of this work was carried out in accordance with the protocol, which outlines the specific search syntax, the databases, the inclusion-exclusion criteria, the methods for extracting, etc., in this protocol. So the review question that we tailored the actual mapping exercise around is, in nutrition research studies, how are daily intake levels of low-calorie sweeteners in human populations assessed in the context of acceptable daily intakes derived by authoritative bodies? This was addressed specifically using the PCC structure, or the population, concept, and context. So we defined each of these elements as shown on this slide, and based on each of these elements, we also derived inclusion and exclusion criteria for each component. So for example, the concept being comparison of the ADI values to a daily intake of low-calorie sweeteners, we required that studies reported a quantitative intake estimate of specific low-calorie sweeteners included. However, we would exclude studies that estimated exposure via, for example, blood or serum or urine concentrations. So we required a measure of intake, and similar inclusion and exclusion criteria were developed for each. Following implementation of our search strategy using multiple databases, PubMed and Embase, we came up with a fair number of articles that were screened at the title and abstract level. For those that made it through based on the title and abstract, we obtained full text. Through these exercises, we also implemented a deduplication process. We also looked at studies and included additional studies based on hand searching and reference chasing. Throughout this process, we did exclude a fair number of the studies. Common reasons for exclusion were, for example, that there was not a quantitative intake estimated or measured, it was not a population of interest, or it was a low-calorie sweetener wasn't addressed but might have just been mentioned in a study. As we applied the criteria through the multiple phases, we ultimately charted or included 121 studies. Now, for these 121 studies, that compared an intake to an ADI in some capacity, we had to further refine these or categorize these based on their relevance. And this was a refinement to our protocol that was implemented at the stage of review or calibration. This was needed because we were observing that within our evidence base, which was incredibly heterogeneous, the study designs and objectives really varied. We were finding not only primary research, but secondary research and reviews that were addressing this topic, but in different ways. Also unique to this study, the type of information that we were looking for would commonly be reported in the discussion, for example. So unlike looking for studies that met very specific research objectives in terms of an experimental design, we were looking more for how data were being interpreted relative to the ADI, which makes the evidence slightly, it could be difficult to look for, or essentially also required that we looked at full text for many more publications. We used two categories for this included evidence: directly relevant as well as contextual. So for the directly relevant category, the study had to make a comparison of an intake or a controlled exposure to an ADI, whereas for the contextual, these studies were important to informing the question, but weren't direct evaluations. These were often reviews and et cetera. By taking this approach, we were able to prevent collection of duplicate data. In many of the reviews, the primary studies were assessed. We also collected different volumes of information from these types of studies. So getting a little bit here into the findings, the study characteristics by the level of relevance. So here on the left, you see the actual sweetener, the individual sweeteners, including the first year of publication, where there was a comparison. Aspartame was the first year, was a publication, was a sweetener that was first published on in context of comparison to ADI. It also had it was one of the sweeteners with the most directly relevant publications. So this next chart shows the publication frequency for each of the low-calorie sweeteners of interest by year. Now, clearly, you can see that the publications comparing has certainly increased over time. In fact, over half of the identified studies were published in the final 8 years of our mapping exercise, compared to the approximately 20 years prior to that. I can give you a minute to study this, but you can see that consistent with the slides before, several of the sweeteners, perhaps more commonly used or more commonly evaluated, sucralose, saccharin, aspartame, tended to have the most publications within a year and across time. Also of interest was a geographical distribution of the studies that we were finding. Here we've shown the darker the shading, the higher the number of studies in the populations for this area. There were several characteristics of interest in here. For example, Ireland was one of the countries with the most publications. However, a number of those publications come out of the same laboratory. So as we go forward to map and chart and interpret these results, we'll provide breakdowns of the evidence in such a manner. Also of interest when you think about the geographical distribution is the context of the ADIs used. So as we heard, the ADIs undergo a rigorous process, but there are also multiple authoritative bodies that establish values, ADI values, or similar. And so when you think about the geographical distribution, we have also categorized the ADIs being used. The majority of the studies use the ADIs developed by EFSA, so those are primarily the studies conducted in Europe, followed by those from JECFA, and then FDA. So as we continue to work through the charting, the element of interest is really to see how the ADI was used. And this is, as we collected information, it was certainly very complex because of the heterogeneity of the evidence base. And so the way that we are approaching this is for the studies that were categorized as direct, so they had a direct measurement of low-calorie sweetener in some capacity, we combined 4 elements of the given study: the goal of the study, the population and health status, age, and then the context that the comparison was being made. And so over to the right, there's a figure that shows, or a map that shows, some of these relationships. And as you can see, there really is quite a span. So we're looking at many different populations. There are many different objectives. And the number of studies, which is emphasized by the thickness of the line, also varies across the evidence base. Overall, we had there was good coverage for a number of areas of interest. Most, for example, if there was a study in a diabetic population, there was more than one. So shown here are some of the themes that we are going to be able to gather in terms of characterization of this evidence base. So drilling down a little bit more on these comparisons of how the ADI is used in the evidence base, there were generally a limited number of categories of how ADIs were used. The majority of studies in the evidence base were EDI to ADI comparisons. So these were studies that looked at dietary intake, whether that was measured or modeled in a given population. They often looked at multiple sweeteners and then compared the output, or the EDIs, to ADIs. And so that was shown in the blue here on this wheel. We also found a number of studies that looked at, discussed the ADI in context of safety or adverse effects. And these studies, for example, used the ADI as a way to determine the type of dose to use in an experimental animal study, for example. Perhaps they were looking at specific safety endpoints and they wanted to mimic what human exposure may be. Conversely, the ADI was also discussed in safety studies where if an effect in a study was seen, the exposure levels associated with that effect were compared to the ADI. There were also a handful of studies looking at ADIs in context of metabolism and thinking about how the ADI level could be used or interpreted in context of metabolic differences, etc. So as we continue to work through the synthesis and interpretation, we'll be working with our advisory panel to go through more of the details with particular focus on the ADI to EDI portion of the evidence base. Overall, we had found that, as reported by the study authors, the ADI is generally used in an appropriate manner, and only very few of these studies reported concerns or thoughts in context of potential exceedances of the ADI or how the ADI is used. But by and large, we were seeing comparisons that are consistent with the definitions of the ADI. We will also do additional breakdowns by populations, health status, age, etc., and then combine this with the advisory panel's expert knowledge in this area to help identify possible needs for additional tools or approaches for education and communication for practitioners and health professionals. This work is also currently being drafted in the form of a publication and will be submitted to a peer-reviewed journal. And with that, I thank you very much again for your attention and the opportunity to present these findings.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. We've covered a lot of information today, which we realize may be new to many of you that typically focus on nutrition and less on safety. So how is this information applicable to nutrition practitioners? This brings us to a presentation by Dr. Deepa Handu. Dr. Handu serves as a Senior Scientific Director for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence Analysis Library. She has methodological expertise in conducting systematic reviews and quantitative analysis in the field of nutrition. And in her position at the Academy, she has led the development of a number of systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines. And she's conducted research to actually improve evidence-based methods for the library. So I will hand it over to you, Dr. Handu.
Thank you so much, Marie, and I hope my slides, everybody can see my slides, just confirming that. And thank you to everyone who's been so patient and listening to our speakers. 10 more minutes, so stay with me. And just a disclosure that this presentation is presented by me, developed by me, and it reflects my experience and my knowledge in this field and not the Academy's position or policy or anything. So moving on. So like when I started thinking for this presentation and thinking what would the practitioners want to think about, when it comes to low-calorie sweeteners, the thoughts in my mind were safety first, ADIs, which you have heard a lot from everyone. I'm going to a little bit talk about it, not in details as others did. Then comes to mind is effect on health outcomes. Is there any scientific evidence that clarifies that issue? And then finally, what do I tell my clients? So let's talk about safety a little bit. As you have heard from previous speakers, a lot about ADI, so I'm not going to go into details. But what I wanted to say mainly is that low-calorie sweeteners are thoroughly tested and carefully regulated by FDA in US and Health Canada in Canada for approval to use in foods and beverages. As mentioned before, the ADI is the amount of an ingredient that a person can safely consume every day over a lifetime without risk. It's an extremely conservative number to make sure that there's no chance of harm. This slide states, unless the FDA and Health Canada approved low-calorie sweeteners, I'm not going to read each of them. So what foods typically have low-calorie sweeteners? Nowadays, low-calorie sweeteners are widely present in foods, medications, personal care products like your toothpaste might have it if you go and look at the ingredient list, and in many other foods and beverages which are not marketed specifically for weight management. So talking to your clients, think about telling them to read ingredient lists, because we are very familiar with some of the ones over here like diet sodas, some energy drinks, or sport drinks, but people never think about yogurts, that flavor yogurts might have these. So thinking about, other foods and non-food products that can be out there, which might have these low-calorie sweeteners present. The next question that always comes to mind is safety. So at present, based on evidence, low-calorie sweeteners are safe and approved by the regulatory bodies. They are some of the most researched and studied food ingredients. However, at this point, we still keep on debating about the long-term effects on human health. So there is still that issue hanging on, but based on all the organizations that are regulating the quality of these things, we should feel confident and safe. This slide states the current evidence on low-calorie sweeteners, and as you can see, it is a little conflicting. So evidence from cross-sectional and prospective cohort studies suggests that the use of low-calorie sweeteners is associated with increased body weight, whereas evidence from randomized controlled trials suggests that the use of low-calorie sweeteners for weight loss, is beneficial. So that's where the whole confusion comes in between. And then comes the other types of study designs like systematic reviews and meta-analysis. The findings from these studies is a little bit mixed. So most of the discordance that we see in these findings, they could be due to a number of factors like study design limitations, and sometimes it's challenges in interpreting the findings. Okay, sometimes that's what population is being studied. So when we talk about cross-sectional and prospective studies, for most of these studies, we do see a lot of self-reported data. So that might be and one of the issues. The other issue in those kind of studies, which has popped up a lot, is something called effect modification. That means the existing unhealthy diet could be influencing this relationship. Also, sometimes the association between sweetener consumption and weight gain Maybe because individuals, they're already predisposed to obesity and they consume more sweeteners in their attempt to prevent weight gain. Usually you'll see it written up as a reverse causality, that they're assuming something and they're doing to fight that, they're doing this action of consuming way more. There can be a lot of other unmeasured, unexplained factors that could influence this relationship between the sweetener consumption and weight-related metabolic outcomes. It's like in most of the food-related studies and nutrition-related studies, there's so many cofactors that can influence that relationship. And one of them could be that when people consume non-nutritive sweeteners, they're also consuming some sugary foods. They do not change the full diet itself. So there's a lot of debate right now about this conflict between evidence and hence the systematic reviews and meta-analysis, which are a top-level study design, and they are mixed too. And the reason being they're based on the original research study. So when you merge those studies in, you're still getting a confused and conflicting result. There are many organizations out there that have developed these guidelines in regards to low-calorie sweeteners. They all have a little different take on the message as they're addressing different populations. Also, the approach of developing these guidelines are a little different. Some of them are based on systematic reviews, some of them are based on comprehensive reviews. So a little bit of difference in the angle could change the language a little bit. Overall message, most likely from all of them, is kind of a standard message, but you'll see a little different take by them if you start reviewing them. There are references for all these at the end of the presentation. The Academy, on the other hand, has two guidelines in this area, and one of them is in the pregnant diabetic women. It was published in 2016. I'm not going to read the full thing, but the bottom line of this guideline was that if pregnant women with gestational diabetes choose to use a non-nutritive sweetener, they can, but remember, you should select the FDA-approved ones, and you should limit your dietary intake to ADI, within the ADI. So within the safe range, the ones that are recognized safe, okay, if they consume those, they should be okay. There is no evidence right now to show any adverse effects with consume it. The Academy also has another guideline on the diabetes people who have diabetes. This was published in 2015, and the message is mainly saying that it's safe to be consumed within the recommended ADI. However, you should educate your clients and remind them, the big thing is that they should know that other sources of calories and carbohydrates in these foods are also present, and they need to be taken into consideration. Use of non-nutritive sweeteners has the potential to reduce overall calorie and carbohydrate intake if substituted for caloric sweeteners without compensation by intake of additional calories from other sources. So again, emphasizing a moderation of intake of all other food groups as well as a full diet becomes very important. So what are the major practice implications for, and from the dietitian's perspective, what should you know? You should be familiar with the science behind non-nutritive sweeteners for sure, because that's how you'll prepare yourself and be ready to answer the questions of the clients. But you also need to understand how each sweetener works, their function and how they taste. Those are a little different. Non-nutritive sweeteners can trigger slightly different trace receptors, and they have different properties when they are used in different applications, like acid foods or heated foods. So being a little familiar about that, and also to work with your clients to understand their needs and interests. You might realize if you work with one right now that some of them have preferences for certain non-nutritive sweeteners compared to others, and this brings their personal preference in. So talking to them in that respect is very important. Understanding the science brings the whole question about how do you look at this evidence when you know there is so much of conflict going on. The key thing to keep in mind would be, please do not base your opinions on one single study. In today's day and age, when everything gets published so fast and there's online medium, what you see is a study popping up here, or a newspaper covering just one study and talking about it. But beware of that single study syndrome. There's something called that, because people base their opinions just on one study. So when you're reviewing literature, make sure that you evaluate the study of the day for their methodological issues. Look at whether the studies are animal versus human based. who is the population of the study, whether they're healthy people, overweight people, people with diabetes, etc. So the condition of the population they're studying is very important. Whether they're epidemiological studies versus clinical trials, we did talk about them a little bit. Remember, clinical trials provide excellent results, but are they applicable in free-living people? Whereas epidemiological studies have the whole issues of confounding factors. So do those studies control for some of the known confounding factors or not? Other big thing is the dose. Dose of the LCS is very important. Some of the studies that have shown historically, some of the studies have shown that have shown adverse effects, they were giving way above the ADI doses. So keeping in mind what is an appropriate ADI, what kind of doses, and what are these studies talking about. Also making sure that these studies are doing some comparisons between treatment group and a control group comparison and reporting those, not just focusing on one area of we are feeding LCS, what happens, but trying to make comparisons within that population base. So these are some core things to keep in mind when reviewing studies. There's some other things which a lot of you might be familiar with, but when you consider using LCS and working with your clients, make sure the key things are blood glucose response, nutritive values, sweetness, how are they going to be used, ADI, FDA approved, and then also take into consideration some special considerations, certain conditions that your clients might have. So if someone has an increased desire for sweet intake, do you replace? Basically, over here, I'm trying to tell you, what do? You might be still feeling confused. So what do you do with your client? Are you going to say recommend or not recommend using LCS? So it just tells you work with an individual client. Some of them could have increased desire for sweet intake, and in those scenarios, replacing some of high sugar foods with LCS would be very helpful, because it does help cut down your caloric intake. Keeping in mind, they are paying attention to other things that they're eating. Make sure that it's FDA approved. And the other thing to remember when you're educating or discussing LCS with your client is that although many products in the marketplace use artificial sweeteners, it doesn't mean that the product is completely carbohydrate or calorie free. So use the artificial sweeteners, they might be still high in fat, saturated fat. So these products that are out there and they are kind of saying we use artificial sweeteners, look out for the fat content, the saturated fat or salt content. It's still essential that people read nutrition labels before they buy a particular product. So based on the current evidence that we have right now, there is no reason not to recommend if somebody wants to use it and incorporate in their diet. The key thing to remember is that the potential benefits from low-calorie sweetened beverages or foods as a replacement for sugar-sweetened beverage will not be fully realized if their use is accompanied by a compensatory increase in energy intake from other sources. So again, bringing in the concept of overall healthful dietary pattern is advised. Yes, you can substitute some things in your diet, but that's not a magic bullet. There are other things that you still need to take into consideration and think about that are important. That's all, keeping time and everything in mind and going quickly. I think that's all I had, but if any questions are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Handu. That brings us to our wrap up and Q&A. So if anyone has questions, please type those in the chat box. Again, if we can't get to them today, we will still be able to answer those and post on the Diabetes 365 forum. Just to let you know, if you would like a record of your participation, it would be helpful, or it's kind of required to fill out that post-webinar survey, and that will be available, as you can see here, on the event page where you registered after the webinar concludes, so you can just go back there after this is over, and the survey should be posted. We have a couple of questions that we'll answer. One is, of course, everyone wants to know if the slides will be available after the presentation. We actually won't have the slides necessarily, but we'll have this entire recording available, and I believe we'll be able to provide everyone who registered with a link to that recording. So we'll do that shortly. So one question is, I think this is for Joanne or anyone in Canada, but the question is, do you know of a couple of current examples of products in Canada that actually contain advantame?
Oh, okay, it's Joanne here. So currently, advantame is accepted as a sweetener in Canada. It's not currently in any products. I think it just this past couple of weeks ago, I think there was approval for it to be used in certain beverage and food products. So I think it's to be seen in the near future where that will end up on the shelf.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. And in the interest of time, I think we're actually a little bit over. If you have more questions, there is an opportunity in the survey to type your questions, so that's another way we can answer anything. So we just want to thank everyone for participating today. We really appreciate it. We would love to have your feedback on the survey on this, and it also asks if you'd like to learn about any other topics. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great rest of the day.